Welcome back, everyone, to Furthering Christendom. I am your co-host, Mike DeVito, here as always with Dr. Tyler McNabb. And today we have a highly sought-after guest, somebody who I've gotten a number of recommendations for, and that's philosopher Dawn Eschenauer Chow. Dr. Chow is an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at the College of DuPage in Illinois. She received her PhD from the University of Chicago. And her research focuses on philosophy of religion, religious language, justification of religious belief, the nature of God, all the stuff that we love. And so before we get into our topic today, Dr. Chow, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's really an honor to have you here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So today we're going to talk about an essay that you wrote for Faith and Philosophy called The Passible of God, A Plea for Analogy. And just to lay out the argument real quick, and I'll read this from the abstract. It says, I argue that Christian believers should take an analogical approach by believing that God does something relevantly similar to loving us in a way that involves vulnerability to suffering, and thus conceiving of God as loving us in that way while simultaneously believing that God is in fact impassible. And so before we get into the actual argument, maybe you could just lay out for us, what does it mean to say that God is impassible, and why might somebody adopt that view of God in light of God's love and suffering and things like that?
Yeah. So the claim that God is impassible can actually mean a few different things. So I think one version of the claim in the classical tradition is that God is not subject to changes, that God doesn't change states over time. Another is that God doesn't have emotions. That's a version that gets a lot of attention now. The version of the claim I focused on was the claim that God is not vulnerable to suffering. Where by suffering we mean like any sort of negative emotional state or any like grief, sorrow, that kind of thing. And so one reason you might want to say that God is impassible is just because that is a major part of the Christian tradition from the church fathers, like for almost the entirety of the history of Christian thought up to like the 1800s at least. And so if the tradition is important to you, then that's a reason. For me, the reason I'm really drawn to saying that God is impassible is because I have I'm very strongly drawn to a pretty classical conception of God, where God is radically transcendent. So something sort of similar to Aquinas's conception of God. And if you think of God as radically transcendent, it doesn't make radically transcendent in the specific way that I do. It doesn't make sense to think that God could literally be like hurt by his creatures. And so if you think God is sort of ase or sort of the foundation of all existence, there's something wrong with thinking that then creatures could then come back and sort of put a dent in God. Like that doesn't it doesn't work like that. The argument I made in the paper, I tried to present an argument that might appeal to somebody who isn't already very drawn to the classical theist position, because I know many people are not. So one argument that Richard Creel makes, which I think is very clever, is he says, the reason people give for saying God is passible, that God is vulnerable to suffering, is because they think it's necessary to say that God loves us. But if that's the reason, well, God doesn't just love us. God loves us a lot. Like God loves us to a maximal degree. So if the reason you needed to say that God suffers is because that's necessary to say God loves, well, then God must not just suffer a little. God must suffer a lot. Like God must be suffering more than any human being ever has, because God loves more than any human being ever has. And then it seems like you're conceiving of God as an object of pity. And that just doesn't seem right. That doesn't seem to make God an appropriate object of worship. So that's the sort of case for impassibility. I have to admit that in writing this paper, I was sort of using this issue of passibility and impassibility as a test case for the doctrine of analogy. So for me, like the analogical strategy I take was maybe more my focus rather than this issue of passibility. But I do think the issue of passibility is a real puzzle. At least it's one that I feel before. So.
Well, you are right at home here at Furthering Christendom. We are right in line with your thinking. So that's fantastic. Maybe before we get into the actual argument, just sort of the converse of what I just asked, what is the passibilist position as it relates to the nature of God? And I think you touched on it already, but why might someone adopt this position in light of God's love and suffering?
Yeah, so the common thought is that if God loves us, that must mean that God is vulnerable to suffering. In particular, that God would feel grief if something really, really bad happened to me, like if I rejected him and died rejecting him or something like that. That it doesn't seem, we don't seem to be able to form a conception of true love in the most robust, full sense of the word, that doesn't involve some degree of susceptibility to grief if harm comes to the beloved. And I think Nicholas Wolterstorff is the person who's made this case most persuasively, in my opinion, where he says, I know what it might mean to evaluate a potato. Maybe my job is to evaluate potatoes, and I hold up one potato, I say, this is a good potato, and I put it in the box. I hold up another potato and say, this is a bad potato, and I put it in the trash. And I could do that without feeling any emotions, without feeling angry at the bad potato or sad about the bad potato. But that's a case in which I don't actually care about the potatoes. So you can evaluate a thing without feeling an emotion, but you can't care about a thing without feeling an emotion. And loving involves caring. And he says, I just can't conceive of what it could mean to say that God loves us without feeling even the slightest hint of grief when one of us is destroyed or when something really, really bad happens to us. And I think he's right. I also cannot conceive of that. And so that seems like a very strong case for saying, no, we have to conceive of God as vulnerable to suffering, as vulnerable to grief, if we conceive of God as loving us.
Well, Tyler, I'll kick it over to you now. We'll get into the meat of the argument.
Yeah. So thanks for coming on, first off. Yeah, so the idea here is that if you want to say that God is loving, then you might have to say that God, at least given how we conceive of love and the best sort of love that we can conceive, that God is vulnerable to suffering, to hurt. And this maybe is in tension with saying that God's perfect, right? Or at least God's perfect as it's classically conceived. And so if you hold these two positions, there's sort of a problem that emerges. Can you explain your solution to the problem?
Yeah, and so you put it just right. So we have, on the one hand, I want to say that God loves us. On the other hand, I want to say that God is not vulnerable to suffering, and that seems to entail that God doesn't love us. So what am I going to do? So the best way I know to explain the solution is actually to give a different example. And this is the example I use in the paper, but this is my favorite example. So suppose Jane is a person who somehow has never gotten any contact with modern science. And so she's never learned any science, but one day a high school science teacher discovers her and finds this out and is horrified. And so sits her down to tell her about atoms. And so the teacher says, okay, so I know you probably think air is just like empty space, but actually there are these little teeny tiny objects called atoms flying around through the air. And well, what are atoms? Well, atoms, they're kind of like a rubber bouncy ball, because they're, atoms, they're sort of spherical, approximately. And they're elastic, they bounce off of each other. So the best analogy is like, think of like a rubber bouncy ball, but really, really, really tiny, so tiny, you can't even see it through a microscope. And so Jane says, okay. And then the teacher says, and also every other physical object that you've ever encountered is also made of atoms. So the table is made of atoms, but in the table, the atoms are close together, where in the air they're far apart. And that's what makes the table solid, in the air not solid. And Jane says, okay. So if Jane was very clever, she might then ask some questions. So one question she might ask is, well, okay, so I know that the atoms in my table must be brown because the table is brown. So what color are the atoms in the air? And then the teacher might say, no, the atoms in the table aren't brown. Atoms don't have colors. And so Jane says, oh, so they're clear like glass. No, atoms don't have colors, but not by virtue of being transparent like glass. Atoms are just not the sort of thing that could have a color or not have a color because they're too small. And you can imagine Jane, who has no modern science, like is not going to have the conceptual resources to make sense of that right away. And another thing Jane might say is like, well, so if atoms are like bouncy balls, that means they're solid. And you just told me that solid objects are solid because they're made up of atoms packed close together. So are atoms made up of smaller atoms? And the teacher says, no, they're made of something, but not atoms, no. And then the teacher has to go away and Jane never gets any further explanation. Okay, so that's the analogy. This is a weird analogy. So what I want to say is imagine Jane is in this situation where she's gotten this very partial picture from a trusted authority, from a teacher. She trusts the authority, but the things she's been told don't quite fit together, right? She has this picture where she's told atoms exist and atoms are kind of like little tiny rubber bouncy balls. But she can also see that atoms aren't exactly like little tiny bouncy balls. And she can't quite put together the things she's been told into a fully coherent picture. If she got more education, she could, but right now she can't. So what I want to say is, so Jane is in this weird epistemic position. What would be the best stance for Jane to take in this position if she can't, if like getting more science textbooks isn't an option? What I want to say is, well, she could think about it. She says, well, so I'm gonna actually back up a little bit. So let's think about the concept of a physical object. Jane has a particular concept of a physical object, which is a sort of a pre-scientific conception of a physical object. For what are physical objects? Well, I'm one, this pen is one, a rubber bouncy ball is one, a table is one, water might be one. And so Jane has a certain common sense conception of what a physical object is. Physical objects are either solids, liquids, or gases. So Jane is going to say, well, I've been given this account of atoms on which atoms they're similar to a particular kind of physical object, namely a rubber bouncy ball. But I also know that atoms cannot actually be physical objects in the sense I understand, because atoms are neither solids, liquids, nor gases. Because to be solid, liquid, or gas is to be made up of atoms in a particular way. So atoms are not physical objects in the sense that the word Jane currently understands, but they are similar to a certain kind of physical object. So she got an analogy for atoms. The story that the teacher gives her is a story that says, think of atoms as like a particular kind of physical object, a rubber bouncy ball. So she's told that's the closest I can get to the truth. But it's not exactly right. They're not actually physical objects in any sense of the word that you understand. Of course, the teacher has a conception of physical objects that does include atoms. The teacher has a more sophisticated concept of physical objects that Jane doesn't have. So what would the best position for Jane, be for Jane to take? It'd be to say, it wouldn't be to believe that that tables and chairs just are made up of atoms and atoms are literally physical objects. Because if Jane thinks that tables are made of little tiny bouncy balls, that's not exactly right. Atoms aren't just very tiny versions of macroscopic objects like bouncy balls. That would involve thinking of atoms as having colors or else as being transparent, when neither of those is accurate. So she shouldn't think of atoms as literally, that's the wrong thing to say. She shouldn't believe that atoms just are physical objects in the sense she understands, because they're not. But she should think of atoms as like physical objects, because that's the only conception she has available. And it would be silly to just say, well, this picture the teacher gave me doesn't completely line up and make sense, therefore I'm going to throw it in the garbage. No, it's getting at something really importantly true about the world, to think of tables as made up of little tiny bouncy balls, even though that's not exactly right. So she should think of the world as made up of little tiny bouncy balls. But she should also recognize that that picture isn't exactly right, that there's a deeper truth that it's getting at imperfectly that is currently inaccessible to her. And so she should have a certain humility. She should say, I'm going to use this picture because I think it's the best, it's the closest to the truth I can get in my current situation. But I should also recognize it's only analogically related to the truth. It's not exactly right. Okay, so that was a long digression, but what I want to say is we should do that with respect to God's love. So when we turn back to the situation with God's love, we have a trustworthy authority has told us that God loves us. But we also have, trustworthy authority giving us other information that doesn't quite fit. And so we're in that same position where the different bits of information we're given, like we can't quite see how to fit them together. And so what I want to say is what you should believe is you should conceive of God as loving us in an emotional sense, where that will mean that you're conceiving of God as feeling sad when something terrible happens to one of his children, or feeling sad when one of his children rejects him. But you should also believe that that picture is not exactly right. You should believe that your picture of God's love is only analogically related to the truth, that it's getting at something importantly right about God, but that it's not like strictly accurate, that there is a deeper truth that it's imperfectly related to. And so that's my analogical account.
Sorry there, I forgot to push the unmute button. Yeah, no, thanks for that. So what would you say is like the best sort of response or objection that you've heard to your account, and how would you respond to that?
That's a good question. So I think one, I don't know if I think this one's the best one. It's not the one that grips me the most, but it's a really important one that I think many people have. So for many people, when you say, well, we should interpret the claim that God loves us analogically, that's gonna feel like a threat to something very precious. That's gonna sound terrible, because the way that's gonna sound is like, oh, so you're saying God doesn't really love me. And then end of discussion. So I think that's a very forceful objection. And I want to say that would be a mistake. And here it helps to appeal to something that will sound very familiar if you're familiar with Aquinas. So Aquinas has this point, Aquinas famously also says that we speak analogically of God. And Aquinas makes this distinction that's sometimes put as in the order of knowing, we speak primarily of creatures and only secondarily of God. So when I think about love, I know what creaturely love is. And then I have to apply that sense of creaturely love to God, even though it doesn't quite fit. But what he says is, in the order of being, the priority goes the other way. So he says, God's love is what's ontologically prior. And we are the ones who have love only in a secondary sense. He doesn't actually say this about love. He says it about goodness or justice or something, but same idea. So it's God's love, which is ontologically prior. The thing we call love is only love in this muddled, derivative, secondary sense, in this imperfect sense. And so what I want to say is, it's when I say that, God loves us analogically, I say that has to be interpreted analogically, people are likely to hear that as saying that God is less than loving. That we human beings have real love and God has this other thing that's not quite love. That is not the idea. The idea is God has more than love, not less than love. That it's we who fall short. But that from the epistemic position, that's still analogical. So if God has something that my conception of love is just this very derivative, dim representation of, and what we have is this shoddy, imperfect, derivative form of love instantiated in this very specific context of a human being, which is a very different kind of being from God and very limited. So I know what love is in the human context, in a human being. And I don't understand God's nature well enough to extrapolate up to see what love would be in God. But whatever it is, it doesn't make sense to say, well, that's not true love. No, this isn't true love. That if there's anything that deserves to be called true love, it's that thing in God. But I know that my concept of love doesn't line up with that truth.
So would this be a fair way to summarize your view? When it comes to impassibility, we should accept it, full stop, accept impassibility. When it comes to understanding God being love, we should think about it as we think about how humans would love, or how the best sort of love that we can think about. We should think about it like that, but at the same time, we should know or believe that it's not exactly like that. That this is the best way that we should sort of conceive of it, talk about it, think about it, but when it comes to actually focusing on what it means for God to love, we should know that it's something like that, but even greater. Right? Is something like that what you're arguing?
Um, so that's a sort of a fair paraphrase, but I would want to push back a little bit. So I'm very drawn to the view. So this didn't come out in a specific paper, but I'm very drawn to the view that everything positive, intrinsic, and true that we can say about God is analogical. So I'm not committed to that view, but I would like to defend it. I would like to at least say that it's workable, and I'm kind of drawn to it. So everything positive, intrinsic, and true that we can say about God is analogical. So the options you have for speaking about God is you can say something purely negative, you can say something purely extrinsic, you can say something analogical, or you can say something false. Those are your options. And given that, when I say that God is impassible, so you said, okay, so when we say God is impassible, that's just true, totally committed to it. And when I say God is loving, well, then there's more like caveats. I would actually say that there are caveats on God is impassible too, insofar as I have any positive conception of what it means to say that God is impassible. So when I say, if I merely say, God does not suffer, and I clarify that that's a purely negative statement. I'm not committing to any positive picture of what God is like, but it's a purely negative statement, then sure, then that's just true. But I also don't have any sense of what that means, any positive sense of what that means if I'm saying it purely negatively. When we say that God is impassible, we have a positive, realistically, any human being is going to have some positive conception. They're going to imagine this feelingless being. And I want to say, well, that conception does not resemble, that conception is also not living up to the reality of what God is like.
I actually endorse the same view that you just articulated. So totally on board with that. And it seems like we could take this, right, and respond to various objections to the coherency of theism by saying you're not using you're using these words univocally, right? And we're using this analogically. So divine foreknowledge, freedom issues, or omnipotent paradoxes, etc. We can use it for everything.
All of that.
Yeah, very good, very good. Mike, I'll throw it back to you now.
Yes, Dr. Chow, thank you. This has been just incredibly helpful. I love doing this. It makes so much sense to think of religious language in that sense, where God is ontologically prior, and so what we consider love or justice or mercy or goodness is derivative of what it would be like for God to love or have mercy and justice. So that's really helpful. Before, I know we've taken up so much of your time already. Before we let you go, sort of tell us what's on the horizon now. What have you been working on? Upcoming projects, things we can expect from you coming out in the near future.
Yeah, so I have to. What I'm working on right now is adjusting to a 5/5 teaching load in the middle of a pandemic. But someday, hopefully. In the near future, I hope to return to a few projects. One thing that I have been working on is a paper trying to address this kind of worry that to say that claims are analogical seems like to deny the claims. And so I want to sort of make a case for distinguishing between the claim that certain claims about God are irreducibly analogical, and to show how that's actually very different from revisionary interpretations of religious claims. I think people often feel like they feel similar, and I want to say actually, no, they're doing something radically different. And in the long term, I'm hoping to write a book giving my more full account. So, not this little tiny sliver of an account showing what you can say about this one very specific issue, but I would like to produce a defense of this more radical claim that everything we say about God, that is either, that's positive and intrinsic and true, is analogical. As I said, I'm not totally, committed to the truth of that claim, but I want to say it's workable, and it's a major claim in the tradition. So I want to sort of defend it, so that if you reject it on religious grounds rather than on, the thought that it's not philosophically workable. So I want to produce a defense of that in the long term.
That is fantastic. We're going to have you back on to talk about both of those upcoming projects. So I will link this fantastic essay that you did for Faith and Philosophy in the show notes. And thank you so much for your time, Dr. Chow. Today's been fantastic and really enlightening. So we can't thank you enough for coming on the podcast.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thanks for coming on, and trust me, when we read your paper, we're like, yes, this is the truth here. So thanks for coming on. We look forward to more work.
I don't get that response very often at all, so I'm very glad to have gotten a chance to talk to you about it. Thank you.